a little bit of a background here for everybody. My name is John Mertick, Solutions Architect Community Manager here at Sugar CRM. There's some contact information and pieces for me, along with some of the other groups that I'm a part of as part of my CTO role here at Sugar. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, if you go in the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a question section. Feel free to ask them as we go along. I might take some of them along the way. Others, I'll probably wait till the end and grab them and do them that way, just depending upon how the flow of things go. But as you run into questions, feel free to pose them on there, and we'll definitely make sure we get to them by the end of the day, or by the end of the session here. So a quick overview here of the Sugar 7 roadmap, and we had last month, remember, we kind of had a lot elongated slides here. This is a slide here that's put together by our product marketing team, talking about kind of the roadmap of 7 really at this point here. And where we're at really right now is in this Q4 time frame here, where we're at Sugar 7.1. So currently with Sugar 7.1, all new folks are getting, all new customers on demand are using Sugar 7 now. Along with, if you're a new install on a LAMP stack, you're going to be on Sugar 7.1 now. And we're preparing to begin upgrading select customers who opt in to Sugar 7, and that will be getting started here probably in the next couple of weeks. If you have folks that are interested, definitely make sure that they contact their support or product rep that way. Along with that, the Sugar Mobile 2.0 client will be coming out, or has come out with Sugar 7 support and offline caching. So we have those pieces in there. Q1, we will have Sugar 7.2, which will have the full feature parity, and we'll be able to do upgrades for any LAMP stack folks, so on-site LAMP stack upgrades. Followed by, and that will also have Sugar CRM Mobile 2.1, which will have Sugar Logic Report and offline data load. And then with the shoot at SugarCon to be started to talk about Sugar 7.5 and demoing and betaing that, and 7.5 then, which will be kind of the point of the standard release for all customers. And we'll have a number of new features and stuff coming with it. So that's kind of a very high-level overview plan of where we're at with the Sugar 7 launch. In terms of the exact month estimates for when things are going to be coming down the pipe, 7.2 right now, we don't have an exact in Q1. We're probably looking at a mid-Q1, probably in February. Again, not entirely sure. We're just kind of waiting to see how the engineering stuff wraps up, but that's kind of where we're roughly thinking. And so it's not probably more towards the end, probably more towards the middle. 7.15 is closing here, and that's going to be the release where people can start upgrading 6.7 instances. And that should be very, very soon, probably here, definitely before the holidays. So in the next couple of weeks. And for new on-site customers, you can start going on-site with Sugar 7 now if you're on a LAMP stack. If you're on a SQL Server stack or a DB2 stack, you're going to have to wait for next summer. Looking at the release end-of-life schedule, again, all of this since we've bumped out the end-of-life for 6.5 and Mobile Plus to coincide with the projected 7.5 GA date. Right now, again, tentatively, we're looking at a summer release. So we're just putting in the July 31st. Again, that's all subject to change. It's really going to be 12 months from the point 7.5 GA goes live. So there's a lot of flexibility in that date there. So jumping into the meat of everything here, what we really want to talk about today for everybody is the Sugar 7 REST API and EAPM, right? And I think one of the best ways to kind of look at where we've been with web services is to kind of look at the history of things. So there are probably a few people on the phone that have been in the Sugar ecosystem for such a long time that they remember when the only option was the soap.php endpoint. I had to do some research myself. As it turns out, this came alive with Sugar 1.1 and has been a mainstay ever since. So you're talking, we're coming up on close to 10 years of soap.php, which is a pretty impressive run in and of itself there. with Sugar 5.5, and so Sugar 5.5 was a release in late 2009. That's when we came out with the new SOAP and REST endpoints, and the V2 through V4 syntax kind of came into play there, with the idea of, they would be extensible, but also the SOAP and REST, the calls all mirrored each other. And now we've kind of evolved further, where the SOAP and REST before, the SOAP was a traditional SOAP, the REST was a very RPC style REST. Now we've went to a full REST interface with Sugar 6.7 and with some additional pieces added in Sugar 7 that makes it very RESTful and takes advantage of endpoints and things like that. And just speaking more, pointedly to the move, for those of you who've used our REST endpoint before, our REST services before, it was basically, RPC style. You called functions, you sent function parameters and calls as HTTP parameters and got back a chunk of data with it, right? And now we're using more of a true RESTful style and more of a hideous style, where you have endpoints and each, depending upon the verb you're using, you're going to get different results. So you can be pushing, you can be adding data, you can be getting data, you can be posting data, you can be deleting data, right? And so it takes more advantage of that. It's using more of that traditional construct with REST versus more of the RPC style that we used before. The authentication also switches over as well. So as opposed to before where there was a log-on method that gave you back a session key, now we're using OAuth tokens. So you're requesting an OAuth token, and then you're passing that as a part of the header for every single call that's going back to the system. So if you're wanting to play with this, where is it at? Well, it's under your Sugar. If you're on a Sugar 6.7 or 7, if you navigate to the /REST/v10 endpoint, that's kind of the base endpoint for the entire REST API. There's the nice thing about this API is it's actually self-documented. So there is help available in the app. If you go to the /REST/v10/help endpoint, there's an HTML-based help thing that lists all of the methods out. It has information of how they're all used, some usage examples and things like that, and that's continuously updated. So anytime a new method is updated, including if you add your own, it adds it in there, and you're also given the ability from there, you can add additional optional documentation on how that works. So the login we kind of mentioned a little bit ago, but how do I log into this? What's kind of the difference there? And the big difference is before where you were actually passing your username and password credentials in, now we're using more of an OAuth style. So yes, you're passing those in, but you're getting back an OAuth token versus getting a session key, right? There's a lot of advantages to this. One is that the timing of it, the token timing is a little bit more sane. Two is that you can actually, once you have a token, you can call to refresh that token. So you're not basically having to grab a new session. You can just check to see if it's outdated, and if it is, you can just refresh it. Another one, this will be really useful for folks, is that passwords no longer have to be MD5, so you don't have to use that extra MD5 step. Or in the case that if you're using like LDAP or some sort of other authentication mechanism, there was always confusion of whether do I need to MD5 or not. Now you don't have to at all. It makes it a lot simpler. And the /OAuth2 token endpoint is kind of where you go to get that. And when you make your request, so every request you're making, you're using an OAuth token header, which is where after you make your logon request, you're putting that key in there, and then that is authorizing you for all of these calls going forward. And from there, we'll be able to also tell whether your token is expired or not, and if it has, you can do a simple refresh to refresh and continue on with life. So if we look at a quick code example here, this is a little Node.js for everybody here on the phone that may not be familiar with it. I'm sorry, this is Node.js, this is a Python example. It's really, really simple to get going here, and the nice thing is you'll notice, and we had a series of articles about this over the summer, is that there's a number of language-specific libraries that kind of do a lot of the heavy work for you, so that really all you need to do, so it makes your code examples really simple. So here's using the JSON and request library for Python. Basically, it makes it really simple. All you're having to do is you construct your URL here at the top to grab your token with passing in a payload for the type of grant you want, your username, your password, and your client ID. Post this, you get your response back. If you get a successful response with an access token, you can grab that. You take that access token, you put it as a part of the application headers here, and you notice we're using the auth token header, and then you pass and make your next call here. So this one here is making a secondary call to the me endpoint, which is displaying all the information about the user that's logged on. So it makes this call and it returns back to JSON. So it makes the code really, really much simpler. Before, you were having to do a lot of construction of JSON. You were having to construct a whole query string. It really made all these examples a lot longer. Now, with moving to kind of more of a standard RESTful approach, the libraries you can use to do the calls ends up making it a lot simpler. Because this is a very standard approach that you see with a number of other software applications and tools that you run into. They all kind of using the same sort of thing, so it makes it a lot simpler to do. There's also a number of kind of standard endpoints you kind of see across the board here. There's a search endpoint where you can do kind of global searches across the board. You can query for something. You can query against a specific set of modules. You can use our filters API here. So if you're looking for something specific, you can do a filter check here. So here, for example, you could say, I'm just wanting to filter all of the accounts that have the SIC code of sugar. And you have a lot of different options. So this kind of takes the place of before, where you kind of had this generic where clause here in the get entry or get entries method call. And you were kind of having to construct all this SQL by hand. Now, instead, you can use this filter API to actually do all this for you. And the nice thing is that it standardizes the way you're doing it. You're not having to, you can search against related data very easily. You're not having to kind of construct part of it here and then part of it are related, or use a join, which may or may not work. So it makes it a lot simpler to deal with. And then even on the record front, updating whatever records makes it a ton simpler, right? So you can grab a record very easily. You can update, you can grab it with a get, you can update it with a put. You can create a new one by just posting the content up to a record, and you can delete it with a delete call. And again, the get, put, post, delete, all standard HTTP verbs, all very standard things that people must that people use. The nice part, though, about the REST, the new thing here, is it makes it a lot easier to kind of roll your own endpoint. And this is something that was actually possible in the previous web services, but was kind of involved, required putting a lot of steps together, and was a little bit tricky. But with this new setup, you can actually roll your own. They end up being self-documented, and it makes it really simple to do here. And it's really 3 easy steps. You create a new API class, which would be in the client-based API directory. Whether that would be under your module, or at the application level, depending upon where this REST endpoint goes, or this also can exist under the custom, so it could be custom client-based API or custom modules, your module name-based API directory. Define what that REST endpoint should be, and then write the function that builds it. Really 3 easy steps here. So let's take a look at a quick example here, and the code upline that we've uploaded relates to kind of the start of being able to talk to the Zing API. And for those of you who are in Europe, you'll be familiar with Zing as one of the largest social networks in Germany and in the DACH-speaking region. But we've made a simple example here of being able to grab your profile data here, and we'll build upon this through this whole exercise here. But as you can see here, the Zing API, code here is very straightforward here, right? So we have the first function in here, which is this register API REST, and this is a function here that returns back metadata that lays out, what your API call should look like. So it says, okay, well, what's, we have a definition for it here. What type of requests are we doing? Get, post, delete, put, and so this here we're just saying we're listening to get requests. The path, so this is the path from the root here, so we're saying under the Zing endpoint here, and you can add, and the question mark indicates that we'll be looking at that parameter can be anything, so it's just saying any sort of match, so you could do /Zing John or /Zing Bill or something like that. and then mapping that path to variables. So as we pass it into the function, each of these path components here will be mapped into a variable. So the module will be mapped to Zing because that's kind of a hard-coded one, but the username will be mapped to whatever is put in for that endpoint. The method to call here, so we were saying call the get profile method here, and then a help, a short help and a long help. And the short help kind of displays that the user of the long help here, you can actually point out to external, an external HTML file, or just have a little bit more of a elongated thing below the fold on the help screen here. And for now, we've just kind of made it pretty simple here. We're just having returned it works, but we'll dig more into this example a bit later. So the interesting thing about when we're looking at a service like Zing is that on the back end, there's actually a little bit more work, than just connecting to it to connect to it, right? Zing uses OAuth for authentication, and this is actually a very common pattern that you see out there. Is that these services require that you have an API key for your application, and then as a part of the natural flow, you're passing that API key up to them. And then that user grants authentication for access to your application. It grants kind of that trust relationship. And so the flow that you kind of see here, where the consumer, where the Sugar application, goes to the service provider, gets redirected there to grant the authentication. It gets returned back the exchange grant. Then we're asking back for an access token and the connection made. That's a very common flow in here. Sugar, however, has a really, really nice facility for handling this, and it's called EAPM, External API Management. And it has a defined set of libraries here that really all you need to do is just plug in the guts of how it all works, and Sugar kind of takes care of the rest from both the library and the application standpoint. So let's look a little bit at how this kind of works here. So there's really two components to EAPM. The first is a REST-based connector. So if you're familiar with our connectors API, this is kind of the guts of it here, where we use this REST-based connector, and this is specifically for just handling the configuration pieces to it and the testing of it, so that you could go in the app, you can put in your API key and any other credentials that you need to pass up to the wire. And then the actual OAuth plugin manager class, and this is stored in the external API class. And this here is really what controls how the flow kind of goes back and forth, and really is the actual management of how the calls are made up, what calls are being made, and kind of acts as a proxy between the actual the REST API endpoint and the application itself. So let's break this down here. We'll look first at the REST-based connector. Very simple. It has two kind of pieces to it. One is a config, and those are kind of the pieces that the user can enter in. And then there's also a method in the class test, and this is just the guts for actually how to go out and test the connector. So if we look at the config, it's very simple here. We say what the name of it is. We're saying that this is using EAPM. And then we also have the properties in here of what we're asking for. And we're asking for two properties, OAuth consumer key and OAuth consumer key secret. Those get filled in here, and as you can see, that kind of lays it out there nicely of all these things you can do. But also notice in there that you can do that. We have a test connector button here that's also configurable, so that you can actually trigger whether this is testable or not. And then the testing code itself is actually defined in the connector class, where we indicate here, has testing enabled true, and that means we can actually do testing. We have a bit of kind of stock methods here that we override, but really the guts here is in this test method, which is defined, and this says how do I go about doing a test, and through this we're just saying we're going to load up the Zing external API. We'll grab the properties. Here's what our callback is. Let's make the call to get a request token and make sure it can work. And as long as it does, everything's good. And then that returns back true to the user. So the next piece of it is the OAuth plugin manager class, right? And this is kind of the guts here that kind of describes what the service endpoints are and how everything kind of connects together. And there's really two big parts of it. One is the properties, which sets, these are all of the properties that we need to know about this OAuth service. so that we can kind of do all the redirections and stuff in the background. And then the second piece is the specific methods that we're going to be doing. And there's really one for every single specific method call you're making. You're going to define a method. So for here, we're only defining one get profile, and this is just the method we're calling to get the data we need. And then the second one is this a protected method, which is going to be the proxy and the make request, which basically goes there and assembles the request and sends it out, and then handles getting it back. So it's more of a helper, an internal sort of helper method for making all those calls a lot easier to do. So if we look at the OAuth plugin base here, a couple things to note out here. First, we're saying what's the authentication method? It's OAuth. We're going to need to use authentication, and then this is the connector we're mapping to, ext_rest_zing. These next three protected properties are the key ones here, and these define the methods to call to get a request token, an authorization, and an access token. So these are really important to make sure that you get right, because these are the pieces that are used as a part of the OAuth request flow to make sure that you're going to all of the right URL endpoints. And then we're also, if you're most OAuth services, will support HMAC, SHA-1 signature methods, so you want to also specify that too if yours does. If it doesn't, you can specify the method that it does, the type that it does do. And then on the back end here, we kind of have two calls here. One is our get profile, which is going to go try to make this get request out to the user thing, and then it's going to massage and pull together the results that it's getting back and return that back so that it can be consumed in the API endpoint and returned back to the user. And then here we can look at the make request call, and this one here. Simply, like I said, it's just adding a proxy layer on top of the whole service, right, or the whole call here. So it's adding what the headers are. It's grabbing the OAuth pieces, and making sure there's an OAuth enabled. Going and doing the actual fetch, getting the JSON, catching any errors, and returning back that to the previous methods that will actually go through and parse out the pieces the response it needs to kind of pass on. So for the setup flow for getting an OAuth token going, it's very simple. First you're going to go into enter your API key and other API, app credentials in the connector settings in the set connector property screen. And then each user, when they're wanting to connect their account to that system and leverage the API connector app that you've built, all they need to do is go into their user profile in the external account screen and then use that and add in their credentials that way. They can get going relatively simple. So as you can see, the OAuth process is actually built into the UX of Sugar, so you can manage it all from there. So you're not having to manage it externally. You can manage it directly inside of Sugar with ease. So if you want to learn more about this, we have a lot of documentation about the REST API and EAPM in our Sugar 7 Developer Guide and the Sugar 6.7 Developer Guide. Much of the code from today's webinar is up on GitHub here, so you can look at it, Sugar CRM Zing, that example. And like I said, if you want a Sugar 7 sandbox to play with, get a hold of me, and I can definitely look to make that happen. So we have a number of questions in the chat, which we're going to go through really quick here. And if you have more, again, feel free to go ahead and drop them into the chat window. The first here was about the operators, and we're going to go back to that slide here, which was a little bit earlier on here, about the various operators you have on the filter API here. Operator exact match. I believe it exists. I will double check within there, but I believe the exact match one does exist. How to filter for multiple fields. The documentation and example and API to help does not work. If you want to send me over, if you're having a specific bug you're running into, we can look at that. But you can do for multiple fields here. This filter, it's using kind of a JSON syntax here, so you could just add a comma here and list all the fields that you want out here. But that should work fine. If you have a specific syntax that's not working, I mean, you can contact me offline. We can kind of debug and figure out what's going on. Can our custom API call be in custom make upgrade safe? Yes. All of what we showed you today, you can put in the same location, the custom directory, and it's perfectly upgrade safe. The default ones, obviously, that ship out of the box aren't, but you can add yours in the custom and it'll be found there. How do we get the count of records against the filter query? Previously, we had get entry counts. What's the alternative in the new API? That's a great question. I will take that question offline, and I will follow up with the group on that, but we will find that out. Yes, we'll have the presentation offline. It will be available offline afterwards. Right now, we do not have a bulk insert or update API in the product right now. We're going to be working. That's going to be in a future iteration of the REST API. So for now, you're having to do single updates and single deletes up for this point with it. Is there a way to use OAuth like REST? So the new, I guess I better understand the question using OAuth like, oh, you posted the link there afterwards. So the new REST endpoint does use OAuth. So you are kind of using that methodology. So you are kind of doing it like before. This uses OAuth 2, the older one used OAuth 1. So there is a slight difference there, but you do have, but that's how that is built to use. What is the alternative to set entries? Call me out. The mass entry set date sets all the fields to the same value. I will check on that to see what the alternative is. I'm not entirely sure what that is off the top of my head. To generate, and then another, why I don't want to know why. We want to know, is there any changes to the web to lead form? At this point, there is no changes, and it is existing, and the existing REST APIs and SOAP APIs still do work. So if there is a particular compatibility point, you can still fall back on them and use those as an alternative. We'd love to see people using the new APIs here a bit more and building stuff off of it. But if there is something specific you were able to do before and you can't do now, let us know, and we can definitely see if there is a workaround or if this is something we need to build into it. So very cool. So a lot of great questions here. Another one here. Once the Zing connection is created and set up properly, is it possible to access the functionality from the client as in the new right column widgets? Yes. So what you would just need to be able to do, so if you kind of look at the example that I was starting here, what you could do here, this get profile function here, so this endpoint, you can make the call back out to the external API call that you define for the Zing API. You can plug it in here so that as you're making calls on the REST API, it's making, again, Zing to get the results back. And so then conceivably then, and we'll build upon this for kind of a future session here, using this REST API endpoint, will be kind of the back end of the data for a right-hand side dashlet. So this is kind of where the starting point would be. This is kind of the back end, the PHP end of it, of how do I get the data, how can I present it in a REST endpoint, and then sitting on top of this would be a Sugar 7 dashlet that you can feed it into. And we'll dig into that more into a future webinar. Cool. Well, lots of great questions today and a great session. And this kind of builds on very nicely for next time. As next time we're going to kind of dig in and say, how do we kind of connect these dots here a little bit? Taking the example here of the back end, this is all of the back end of where my data is being sourced for. How do I make the connection to that external service? How do I proxy that through the Sugar REST client? And how do I present that upwards? And then our next session, we're going to build upon that and say, how can I now use all this back-end data, and how can I present this as a dashlet to the user? So this is something we're going to build on for next time. We'll be back in January with that. This webinar will be online here, hopefully in the coming days here. And when it is, I'll definitely shoot an email or a tweet out to the group about this. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. Oh, we have two more things. Oh, the webinar videos. The webinar videos are actually on the support portal, so support.sugarcrm.com. And I will share to all the attendees today. I will share out the links to that as they come online. So thanks everybody for coming today. Great webinar, great attendance. Thank you for all of your guys' time. And we'll be back in January, and we'll take this example a step further here of how do we actually put a dashlet in front of this. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.